Hello everyone. Today we're going to go over chapter 12, which is all about mass audiences and how we measure them, how they are part of the decision-making process in media, and how they are analyzed. So let's start with a little bit of history of audience research. Throughout the history of mass media, media creators knew that public opinion mattered. So Joseph Pulitzer, for example, would go out on the street and in public spaces and look over people's shoulders to see what they were reading and what they were talking about. He would eavesdrop, and then he would edit his publications towards the public interest, and this brought up his circulation rates because he had his finger on the pulse of what people were interested in reading and talking about. So this highly scientific and evolving tactics that go into modern survey industry of public opinion has been of interest to politicians, media outlets, advertisers, and the public since about the 1880s. One of the first polls to cast a really broad net for political interest was the Gallup poll that was done by George Gallup in 1932. His mother-in-law ran for Secretary of State, and she ended up being the first Democrat and the first woman to win statewide office. And George helped her craft her campaign towards the issues based on his polling methods, and he predicted the outcome. Then, 4 years after that campaign, he used his polling techniques to predict the Roosevelt-Landon presidential race. So people really began seeking out his assistance on matters of public opinion and using his information and data to run better campaigns and understand what the people wanted. George Gallup refined his polling techniques to tighten that margin of error. He went from quota sampling, which is using representative groups of people in a sample, to probability sampling, which is a different type of statistical extrapolation, which we will talk about in a minute. So these techniques are still in use, and now we have a $5 billion a year industry of companies that extrapolate and sample our thoughts to sway opinion, to gauge, and to know what needs to be said next. Nielsen primarily covers television ratings. Arbitron covers radio. The Gallup polls are still around, and they cover economic, management, psychology, and sociology views. The Pew Research Institute covers press, politics, and public policy. And a newer company, Harris, has really pioneered ways to poll people online and with internet-based methods. And then, of course, the White House and other government agencies have their own internal polling agencies, which is a good and a bad thing. It means that they're interested in what we are thinking, as well as using the data to construct their ideas around our thoughts. So this is good that they are concerned with our concerns, but it can be used to create crafted rhetoric that shapes our thinking. So let's look at sampling. Sampling is how the population is chosen to participate in a poll, and it can greatly affect the accuracy of a poll or a survey. So let's look at this first one. Probability sampling is the method that was pioneered by George Gallup in the 1940s. And this is a way of sampling public opinion that gives everyone an equal chance of being sampled. And probability sampling is more accurate than quota sampling. And so there's 4 factors that go into probability sampling that make it more accurate. Number 1 is sample size. How many people must be polled to get accurate data of opinions? Well, 384 is the magic number for most surveys. So if you ask 384 people, you will usually be 95% confident that you are within 5 points of a precise reading, which is often good enough for what these polls are designed for. But the sampling has to be done in the right way, and you can't just stand somewhere and ask the first 384 people that you meet and get an accurate reading. You have to pull different people out of the population. So it's essential that everybody in the population have an equal chance of answering the question, and that you're not just pulling answers from people who like to answer the question and that are in agreement with it or swayed in a certain way. So you have to figure out who your sample selection is, and how you choose who you will interview weighs in on the findings of the poll. So if you are polling a place with a population that's over 500,000 people, you have to divide that population by 384. So let's look at this example I have here. If you have a population of 675,000 people that you're trying to find out an opinion from, you would divide that by 384, and that would give you the number 1,758, which would break down to a decimal. And this decimal would indicate that you would need to interview every sixth person. And so if you interview every sixth person, you should get a proper reading from your sample selection. In every poll, a margin of error cannot be avoided unless you interview every single person in the population being polled. Every single one of them needs to be accounted for, or you have to account for this margin of error. If you use the magic number of 384, then you can claim that you have 95% confidence level in your findings. And so it's important in probability sampling that you do the correct sample size, your sample is selected properly, and that you account for the margin of error, which will give you your confidence level in your poll or survey. And the more people you sample, then the lower your margin of error and the higher your confidence level. So you can have an even more accurate poll by sampling even more respondents. Quota sampling is less accurate with a 4-point gap as opposed to the 2-point gap in probability sampling. And when you take quota sampling, the demographics of the people being interviewed in the sample have to coincide with those of the whole entire population. So you have these representative numbers that correspond with the whole population. So let's do an example of 100 people, and let's say 50% of your population is male Protestants from Texas, and 50% of your population is female Catholics from the Midwest. And so you would have to have 50 male Protestants from Texas and 50 female Catholics from the Midwest in order to get representative numbers that correspond to the population as a whole. So when we see surveys in the media or we hear about them on the news, and especially during election time, when you're hearing a lot of surveys and public opinion surveys and polls going on, there's ways to look at them to evaluate if they are valid types of surveys. You have to look at how many people were interviewed and how they were selected. So that's your sample size and your sample selection issues to make a correct survey that you have a lot of confidence in. And you have to look at when the poll was taken, because opinions change over time. You might get a very different survey on the president last year than you get this year, so you need to look at the date that the poll was taken and see if it's still a valid opinion of the people. You also need to look at who paid for the poll, and you have to watch out for privately commissioned polls who might skew their questions in order to get the answers that they want. And then you need to look at the sampling error and understand that a margin of error will exist unless everybody in the population is surveyed. And then you need to also look at how the poll was conducted. Was it on the phone, face-to-face, in somebody's home, in shopping malls? How were the questions worded, and in what order were they asked? If you ask sloppy questions, you get sloppy conclusions, and if you ask loaded questions, you get skewed answers. And sometimes the order that the questions are given can skew the answers of the following questions. And that's probably one of the hardest things when you're actually building a survey or a poll yourself, is to make sure that the way you're wording things isn't interfering with the answers. Many decisions on what we see in the media are based on ratings, and these ratings come from these polls and from sampling the population. Nowhere do you see a bigger impact of these ratings as in TV. The Nielsen polls can lead to cancellations, and they can actually control advertising rates during shows. And I'm sure many of you have probably experienced your favorite show being canceled because of low ratings. And this ratings judgment is based on advertising dollars. So a show or a program has to justify its worthiness to be aired based on how much it can charge for advertisers and how many people it can reach. So they lose those key positions in good time slots, or even being shown at all, based on these ratings numbers that Nielsen usually reports. And if they're getting low ratings, they can't charge enough for advertising dollars to make it profitable for them to keep it at the time slots or on the air. And because these rating systems are so important, we have to look at them critically. And some of the criticisms of rating systems are discrepancies between ratings agencies. This can lead to suspicion through advertisers, because at times some agencies might try to fluff up their ratings numbers in order to be able to charge more for advertising for those time slots. Slanted results are something that can often happen when polling or doing surveys, and this is especially common with new polling agencies or private groups who poll with an intention of supporting a claim. They will actually craft their questions to favor their opinion. You have to look at sample selection, because if the sample selections are not done correctly, the results will be incorrect. But even if they're incorrect, they might still get reported on just because the sample was taken. Straw polls are a good example of this, and this is an instance like a public rally for a political candidate. These people all show up to support them, and then they're polled on who they would vote for. And of course they're supporting that candidate, so you're probably going to get a pretty slanted sample selection saying that they would all vote for the candidate they're watching. So straw polls are people, they're involved in the cause, or they are specifically polled because their opinions are likely to match up with what the pollsters are trying to get. So those are really dangerous, and you really need to take a close look at this idea of sample selections and if those are taken correctly and how those can affect the results on ratings and polls. And then we have this phenomenon of hyping, and this is kind of like that sweeps week phenomenon on TV, where you have a bunch of wonderful shows on for a short period of time, and this short period of time usually is when they do all the ratings for television, and so they try to pump up their ratings so they can get more money from advertisers. And this skews the results because they show less enticing content the rest of the year. We also have to look at respondent accuracy. People who are polled are not always honest, and they may like to say that they were watching PBS instead of the Jersey Shore that they were actually watching. So you have to think about that. The respondents might not always give the exactly right answer, but they might give an answer that reflects well on them. And then you have also the phenomenon of zipping, zapping, and flushing, as in advertising dollars are going in to pay a lot of money to advertise during these programs, but with the case of zipping, people flip channels during the commercials, or zapping is this TiVo DVR. We can record a program and just fast forward and zap out the commercials. And then you have flushing, which was kind of the beginning of this idea that maybe people weren't watching the advertisements that were going on during these primetime programs. A researcher in Chicago a long time ago found that the water pressure in Chicago dropped during halftime at the Super Bowl, and so he came to the conclusion that maybe everybody had got up and went to the bathroom at the same time. So there's times during shows that people get up and make a snack or go to the bathroom. So advertisers more recently have started focusing on this idea of engagement ratings, and engagement ratings are more interested in the time the audience stay with the media products and the advertising. So They're just becoming more and more popular, especially as the population becomes more divided and fragmented into smaller groups. We all have niche TV stations like Do It Yourself Channel, Animal Planet, Independent Film Channel, etc., etc., etc. And plus, the internet has endless small pockets of consumers, so advertisers are looking at how engaged audiences are in the advertisements, how long they stay with it, how involved they are, and this lends itself to large corporations seeking smaller niches and TV shows and things of this nature that might not have the highest ratings but may carry more people that would be interested in buying a certain product. So they target them by advertising during programs that their markets watch. The book gave an example of the television show Dirty Jobs. Ford runs truck ads constantly during the show, even though the ratings aren't that high. They are disproportionately high for 18 to 25-year-old men truck buyers. So they've even gone into the host of Dirty Jobs is the host of a lot of their commercials, and it kind of looks like the television show. So it engages that audience specifically. Let's look at some of the measuring tools used throughout time and by a lot of these large companies to find out what the opinion is. Of course, there's interviewing, and this can be done on the phone, this can be done face to face, this can be done in shopping malls, focus groups, that kind of thing. The phone interviews aren't done as often as they used to be because people are pretty resistant to doing telephone interviews nowadays, and they kind of feel that it's an intrusion, and it's just not done because it's not very effective. Then in the 1950s, Nielsen started using a diary system, which was much more cost efficient than doing interviews as well, because it costs a lot of money to send out people to do thousands of interviews. So they started doing these diaries where people were self-reporting in the 1950s. And this worked good, except for a lot of people wouldn't keep up with them, and then they'd have to go back and fill in information. And like we had before, they were reporting on their own, and so 1950s housewife might not want to say that she sat at home watching soap operas all day, so she might put down a different show of educational value or something like that to reflect better on themselves. So respondent accuracy in those wasn't that great. And so in the 1970s, they had diaries and meters, and so people would report what they wrote, but they also had meters attached to their television. And these meters would track which channels they were watching, and there was even buttons where they could switch to tell who was watching television at that time. Some of the meters even had sensors on them that could figure out body mass, and so it would let them know who was watching what channel and with whom and at what time. People meters came out in 1987, and these were kind of the same as the previous meters. But they scanned the television every 2.7 seconds and gave a report called an overnight that was sent electronically to Nielsen, and it let them know who was watching what and when, and it was more detailed than the previous meters. And then these overnight reports were given to networks and media companies who watched them very closely to find out who was on top and who was number one the night before. And then in 2001, Nielsen started using portable meters, and portable meters were made to record what media people were taking in outside of the home. So when they went to the sports bar, or they went to the bank, or wherever you go and you hear media, these portable meters were like a little pager, and they pick up inaudible sounds from the programming that could be classified in some way to figure out what type of media people were watching when they were out. And since they first came out, they found to be most useful to measure what people are listening to as they commute on the radio, which radio stations they're listening to, and that type of thing. So there's new challenges with new media, of course, and the internet. Media Matrix began to measure how many people were visiting websites. And like everything, every new media, there's a learning curve. And so they found out that it wasn't only important to measure how many times people were visiting websites, but also how long they were staying engaged with those websites and the time that they were spending on them. And then Nielsen, again, came out with this A2M2 anytime, anywhere media measurement, where they began to try to measure the media that people were taking in through every kind of device, through portable devices, through television, through their home computer. And so they kind of tracked the media itself to see where it was being viewed and by whom. And they started this with video iPods, a group of 400 people using video iPods. They would track what they downloaded, what they watched, and how much time they spent using it. And then they would take this information that they were already getting from television ratings, the television watching ratings, and then they would combine it with this new source of media online and see how those things intertwined. And they would just they're trying to make a fuller picture of the type of media that we use based on our TV and internet combination that we have going on today. So the size of the audience is important, but it's not the only factor in ratings data. If a lot of people watch something and they don't like it, it matters. So reaction is an important gauge as well. And this can be measured through a few different ways. We can look at focus groups, which are loosely structured interviews that get opinions and reactions from people. And these are still an important tool and they're pretty effective, but usually the group comes together and the opinion of the loudest person there is the one that gets recorded and reflected, and people kind of fall in line behind that person who's the loudest. And then you have sit-down interviews, and these are more personal than phone interviews, like I said before, which a lot of people refuse to participate in. So it's just a more personal way of getting a reaction and finding out what people think about media. And then we have the sci-fi galvanic skin check, and this is where wires are hooked up to people and they monitor heart rate and perspiration and body changes. And so these things are analyzed as positive or negative reactions. And these are interesting, but they lend themselves to favor results for photogenic stories, exciting stories like fiery car crashes and drama, things that naturally raise our adrenaline level and make our bodies react. And then we have prototypes, and these are just test balloons to see how information or products are received. These include movie screenings and TV show pilots, sample issues of publications, and advertising campaign screenings. So these are all just tactics that test the emotional reaction, the emotional side of the media, and how people react to it. So audiences are analyzed by being broken down in groups. Demographics is a broad way to break people down by age, education, religion, if they're male or female, etc. But these demographics can be broken down even further into different categories. Cohort analysis is just people of similar ages. Then you have Geo Demographics, which is demographics mixed with the area that somebody lives in. And then Psychographics, which is a pretty sophisticated way of looking at groups of people through demographics plus lifestyle. And it looks at them through the products that they purchase and the lifestyle that they live and how those products support that lifestyle. So geodemographics breaks us up into zip codes, like referring to 90210 as an income class. In this breakdown, there's 34 different kinds of neighborhoods that are part of one of 40 different clusters. And some of the examples of these clusters are implied by their names, by who they are. You have the Blue Chip Blues, Young Suburbia, Golden Pawns, Blue Blood Estates, Money and Brains. So they each have characteristics of their names, like the Blue Blood Estate is the wealthiest, and 51% of them have graduated college. So what happens is These geodemographics are taken in by publications or advertisers and media groups, and they're targeted through specialized publications that appeal to those certain classes, like a physician's edition of a magazine or like a college edition of a magazine. Let's look at psychographics. Psychographics break people down even further into through their lifestyles through the VALS analysis, and this is an 80-some page inventory of a person's values and lifestyle. And these categories are really hard to track. They're always in flux, and people don't belong in only one group. And throughout your life, you'll probably move between the groups. So let's look at these different groups. Belongers are 38% of the population, and the belongers are reluctant to change. They watch TV and they go to church, and they don't appreciate change too much. Achievers are 20% of the population, and these are prosperous consumers. They make their own decisions and they don't watch that much television. Then you have the societally conscious, which is about 11% of the population. And this is the politically active, aware, upscale, inner-directed person who reads instead of watches TV. Then you have emulators, which is about 10% of the population. They aspire for the good life. They're not exactly sure how to create the good life, so they're prone to suggestions. Status seekers, they want to look like they have everything, but they're not exactly sure how to get there. Then you have the experientials, which is about 5% of the population. These are venturesome people who want to experience life and try new things. And usually they're a little upscale, and so they usually have some of the means to experience some of the things they seek out in life. Then you have the I am me's, which is about 3% of the population. These folks try to set themselves apart and become part of this subculture conformity. They're susceptible to advertising because they're trying to find themselves. A good example of this is punk rock. A punk rock person that rebellious or I'm different than everybody type person, but they're still trying to find themselves. Then you have the survivors. This is a small group of pensioners, and they just work at making ends meet, and that's their main mission in life. They're not really targeted by advertisers too much, as well as sustainers. They're not targeted as much, and these are just people that live from paycheck to paycheck, and every once in a while they splurge on something, and they don't have very much hope for improving their situation. Then at the very top, you have the smallest percentage, the integrateds, and this is 2%. These people are creative and prosperous, and they like to try new things, and they do try new things. They're kind of seen as having it all. So, like I said, all these categories are always in flux, and you might move through several of them as you grow and go through your life. So I have a couple of discussion questions here. What category of vowels do your grandparents fit in? And do you think the category you're in will change over time? So I just want you to think about those questions. We will discuss them in class. And thanks for listening. Have a great day.